What's up, and welcome back to part 2 of our versus multiplayer tuning discussion. Be sure to check out the description for part 1 and the other segments as they become available. As always, my personal views are typed up in the PDF linked in the description, and the guest profiles are down there as well. Now let's hop back in and pick up where we left off last time. So, speaking of the completely separate things between the tunings, one of the things I wanted to bring up real quick is the wall bouncing mechanics and how they're trying to update those on the competitive tuning side. But before we get into the competitive side, Brandon, I wanted to hear what your thoughts were on the state of wall bouncing right now compared to previous games, or if you agree that the hyper bounce should be in the game, or if you think that having some sort of wall bounce delay is the right thing to do.
It's definitely a thought-provoking game mechanic. In Ultimate Edition, there was obviously you couldn't cancel off of walls, and then they had 2, 3, even judgment, and then you also have 4, which you can definitely cancel off of walls, bounce from place to place, and that definitely leads to how the player wants to play the game. I've seen some montages by some of the social clans that aren't really as competitive as Optic and Envious and Echo Fox and them, like S, Chaos, a bunch of those, GSQ. They have a bunch of people that do the hyper bounce, that do strafing, that do left triggers, pop shots, a bunch of different utilizations of their methods of killing other players and performing to the best of their abilities. And basically in the essence of wall bouncing, I like how the Coalition are definitely changing it in competitive to continue experimenting with it. Because leading into another subject, Gears of War 4 is sort of in a very late part of its life cycle, and I think it would be a good idea for the Coalition, now that it's very old in terms of video games, to definitely experiment with the formula over and over and over again, and find what tuning, find what gameplay mechanics, and eventually find what wall bouncing mechanics would definitely benefit in Gears of War 5.
Yeah.
And that definitely would be my stance of what I like what the Coalition are doing, but I can definitely understand the blurry line of why people would be controversial about it either.
Yeah. So, Chris, what's your perspective on wall bouncing?
So I don't want to pretend like I know how many different changes the Coalition made. They made a lot, so I didn't keep up. I think Brandon made an excellent point about the idea of experimenting now that it's late game. But I also wanted to hear Waldo's take on this because I know you're a competitive analyst. So my take, for me, they did way too many changes with the wall bouncing. I think they changed the distance. You could slide at one point, or there was a wall bounce delay, and then they took it out. I've been pretty fine with wall bouncing in Gears 4 since the beginning. I think it's pretty smooth. If I had to select, I would just say to give players freedom and not restrict their bouncing, and just let them have whatever playstyle they want. But for me, even though it is late in the Gears life cycle, you could say, way too many changes in terms of the movement that they're having us play with, and I really just want to see them, either pick one thing or get close to something and just stick it out, because it's kind of frustrating to have to relearn and what is going to be the competitive tuning. So that's what I wanted to ask you, Waldo. Maybe from a competitive player standpoint, is it frustrating for pros to have to say, oh, now I got to learn how to wall bounce like this, or this is going to be the new standard?
It's not. I'm probably one of the people don't know. I am a very big advocate against the wall bouncing system. Not the way that it is. Just there's certain mechanics. We found out. Essentially, the best way to say it is the wall bouncing system the movement system in every Gears game has never been looked at as the core problem of why Gears has issues. Just never was. And then we started bringing it up. The amount of distance that you could close initially, and you could still close, is 7 tiles on checkout, which is really ridiculous. That is one move that the player going at full speed can hit this corner and be playing defensive, which is a big thing that didn't exist in Season 1. We didn't have a lot of defensive play, so what ends up happening in those situations is that the defensive player is punished for not moving instead of being given an advantage because they're setting the person up. So what we suggested, and this is me and a couple other pro players, is if you shorten that distance, you create a smaller window. You create a window where the player has a window of trade-off where you can be punished inside that thing. Now, mind you, there was a bunch of different wall bouncing things where they had the air bounce console cooldown off. Again, I argue for what's best for the game on a competitive level all around. As a spectator, as an observer, you cannot watch Gears of War on no air bounce console cooldown. It is literally impossible. It hurts people's heads.
I like watching it in like a montage real quick. It's like, oh wow, that's amazing that someone could do that. Spectating a tournament or even me playing, I hate it.
It's bad, and honestly, it's been a complaint throughout the entire spectator process that when this is off, even the entire first season, people get nauseous and dizzy because it's too fast. And what we're trying to do, and the overall goal, in my opinion, of what we should do, is kind of go back to a slower Gears 2 style where you have to be more. You can still move crazy, but you have to have some limitations on that so that the game speed slow down. You get an acceleration bonus for wrapping around cover that came from Gears 3. I shouldn't go faster just because I took a piece of cover and whipped around, right? At the same time, the other side of this is that we have really high crazy sensitivities, and that allows Gears is a completely different game if you're looking in the scope of how Gears works. Your camera, your aim sensitivity and your look sensitivity actually controls how fast you can move, because you can wrap around and see another piece of cover, and all you have to do is be in range to do that. If you slow down how fast or create a limitation on how fast the character inside the game can do that, it slows it down. We actually had a test where we had players play at 20 sensitivities, and it was probably the best looking Gears that we've had. But because the game's been out for so long, we can't do a dramatic change like that in this game, which is okay. Like, we're not trying to solve all the problems, but we're starting to realize and starting to show the coalition and issues that overall the game is going to, you have to start looking at all the aspects of it. It's not just that the shotgun does too much damage, it's that you can move too freely with the shotgun, and if you put some limitations on that, then a player has to think a little bit more and set up instead of trying to do these crazy. Because it's, even though some people say you're thinking the entire time of how you're setting up your wall bounces, you're really just manipulating the cover system for your advantage. And if that goes away, then you have to slow down what you're doing and think a couple steps ahead, play it like a chess game, and try to anticipate where the other guy's going. That's what I miss about Gears games. We don't really have that. There's certain situations where you can kind of outstrafe somebody, but the strafe speed's way slower than what you can do in a wall bounce situation, so there's not a good trade-off. When we had 2.1, you could see players that actually utilize strafing a little bit better, because you could stop and then move a little bit faster because the other player had to get closer to the wall before you could engage in combat.
Yeah, so one of the things they did to slow stuff down is have that slip distance cooldown on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about is they're testing all this competitive wall bouncing tuning stuff, and from what I understand, that was to help tune competitive. Are they going to put those changes into core? And
I hope they do. I honestly think it would be better for the game, because then again, you guys should have whatever playstyle you want to play with. And I know some people are going to be like, oh, you're just on the competitive side. I just want a game that's functional, that there isn't so much frustration, that if I get beat because I was outskilled, not because the game mechanics are giving you an advantage. I think that's a frustration point.
I feel like it's just another gap, though. If it's not put into core, not only do we have a different weapon tuning, but there's different movement mechanics. I mean, it's not like the biggest movement mechanic, but I mean, wall bouncing is an important part of the game, and if you have different tuning and different movement mechanics, that's pretty big.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, so Waldo said something earlier about pacing, which I thought was really good and important and applicable here. It's just that, when you go from competitive to core, or vice versa, I mean, you don't want to feel like you have to switch your pacing and you're playing in an entirely different game. So yeah, I'm of the view that if you're going to also alter how the movement works in core versus competitive, it's just another thing for your average player to have to wrap their head around, when maybe they really don't want to have to do that. You want to be able to play whatever game type it is you enjoy with with some consistent settings. So, I mean, whatever they do, for better or for worse, in one set of game modes or settings, I hope they do for the other, just for consistency's sake.
Yeah.
In terms of the universal tuning and then having two different types of tuning, whenever I heard Waldo display and talk about his side of the competitive way he described things, it was definitely eye-opening for me, because I did not realize in the 5 years I've been playing Gears that there are that much aspects that go into the game, and that definitely is crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, people like, I mean, I don't pay that much attention to the competitive stuff. I pay a little bit of attention because I'm involved in the community and stuff, but I've primarily played core, and whenever I talk to Waldo, or anyone in the competitive community, it's amazing seeing like how much detail goes into this stuff.
It shocked us when we figured it out, and the more you learn about things, the more you question the, I guess, foundational mechanics of the game, you start realizing that if we fix, and this is one of the principal arguments that I used when I was talking to the pros, I said, if we fix the foundation of the game and which is the movement system, then what we do with the secondary weapons and all the other weapons means that we could shave some damage off, because that was one of the arguments. I talked to Node in Vegas for a little bit, and I said, it's like, the weapons are too strong, and he said, well, it's because the movement system, and it's the movement system in the shotgun. I said, so the issue here is not the shotgun, it's what is the real point A that we need to fix everything else? And I was like, if we just start taking a look at the movement system as an issue, and then kind of focus on what we can do to make it better, then we can do other things with the weapon tuning, so that the shotgun and the movement system are not the principal argument of why we're not tuning back the rest of the guns.
Yeah. So I guess speaking of Ryan, you have all these weapon values that you've collected. Have you guys had any discussions about Coalition releasing these values and making the official ones publicly known? Because the fans have feedback, and like, I bet you could give a million times better input on stuff if you had the actual values.
I would love to see it. I don't know from their end of what they're going to release and what not they're going to release. It took a long time just to find out we had 600 hit points.
You should have asked me. I've known that since Gears 1.
See, I didn't know what it was. I was like, no one knew what the remedial value was to actually find out the damage. And so when we figured that out, we were able to go back and actually look at weapon damage and make better arguments, because once I knew that information, it was like I had everything but what I had 100%. So you're talking like, oh, we have 100 health. That's how you assume it. When you have 600 health, all of a sudden your window goes from this to like this.
Yeah. And
you're like, I have so much more freedom and we can play with the weapon tuning and send it back and say, like, we could do this for it. And I've done charts with Kenny because they did a Lancer quality of life buff where in competitive, the closer you got to somebody, the less damage you did. And then they got rid of it, and everyone was like, no, we don't want a stronger Lancer. And I took the numbers of the pros, and I said, it's not that big of a deal. Really, all they did is they buffed the Lancer 1 point of damage. And I was like, if we were dealing with 100 points, like, yes, this is a big number. But it did the exact same amount of damage. You downed it the exact same amount of time. It didn't really affect the overall gameplay, and it made the Lancer more consistent, which was a good thing. That I shouldn't be punished for having my Lancer out and someone's flying at me with a shotgun, and my gun doesn't output enough damage in that situation that I'm making the right play, but the game's punishing me. So I don't know how they're gonna like release all the weapon damage. I wish that they would, so that it can be a discussion point. Other people can come up with ideas and opinions. I did it for me just so that I could be, can we fix? I want the game to be the best, regardless of how I feel about competitive and everything else. I want the game to be the best environment, because I've played this for 10 years. It's been a life investment for me. A third of my life has been spent on Gears of War. So when I talk about it and I'm passionate about it, I want the game to have a future life cycle past 5 and 6. I want it to be a game that other people can get into, and they don't just put away for another shooter, right? They get in and they stay, and they invest in the community, and then we have more depth, more competitive players, more content, things like that. So having a better foundation on the game is where I'm going with it as an overall, community figure. But again, I don't know what information is going to be released. I wish that they would release everything publicly. Just be like, here it is.
Even if it's just a simple info dump and it's not very organized, and it's like, hey, you guys want it? Here's the info. If you want to organize, go ahead and organize it yourself. Like, I would definitely take time. Like, I've even asked for raw data for Horde stuff. It's like, give me that data. I will go make charts and grab and make them available. And, like, versus, I would love to see that stuff. But
I think it'd be great, but again, we'll see what happens and how they decide to release everything. But I think it would be great for the game overall, just so that people can understand the only things that are different between the real core tunings is literally your Lancer, your shotgun, and I think it's your pistol. Those are the only things that are different. Everything else is the same. So, unless I'm wrong about the pistol, never mind. The pistol's the same too. So, really, the only thing is the Lancer and the shotgun are the only two differences in the main competitive tunings, and the movement system changes. So, we're really only dealing with two things. They could do a universal tuning. It just depends on, is it accessible enough for newer players that want to just get on and have fun and not have to sweat their life away?
Yeah. So, I guess another key difference between core and competitive is loadout. So,
all
right, so I don't think it's really up for discussion. The hammer burst is overpowered in core, right?
Agreed.
I mean, that's not something
No
we
question.
can really debate here. It's overpowered. The coalitions even acknowledge this.
Mm-hmm.
I personally enjoy having an option of a loadout. I would like to see it balanced. I understand their issues on it. If they drop the hammer burst damage by a little bit, maybe it's going to change the number. It's going to add an increase in trigger pulls. Like, I might have to do an additional trigger pull, and then the gun's too weak or something like that. Especially with burst guns, it's very difficult to balance. But I would like to see a tuning set that allows for loadouts. I just think it adds variety to the game, and I don't know, makes for different play styles. So I know I'm probably in the minority on this with liking loadouts. From all the people I've talked to, everyone wants the universal loadout. But so what are your guys' views on it?
I mean, I guess I'll kick us off.
Go for it.
I actually might be with you, chaps. I don't want to sound hypocritical here because I'm all about the universal weapon tuning. I'm not opposed to people coming out with hammer bursts or enforcers or whatever it is, as long as they don't add the sawed off. That was a nightmare. But I just think it's one of those things where if it is going to be competitive, then I don't know. It just makes sense to me that everyone starts with the same weapon, the Lancer, Nasher, classic loadout. But for the sake of online playlists and whatnot, I'm completely fine if people want to select whatever weapons they want, as long as each gun kind of has its own niche area and one doesn't overpower the other. So that's about all I have to say on that, really.
It's definitely a very blurry line on how to actually balance the secondary weapons and then the weapons that you actually load out with, such as the hammer burst. So besides the hammer burst, the first point I want to make is that the coalition, from the Retro Lancer to Gears 3, which is the Devil Spawn equivalent to the sawed-off, I think the Coalition did a good job of making a downgraded version that wasn't too overpowered in the form of an Enforcer.
I think the Enforcer's pretty balanced. Some people hate it, but I think it's pretty balanced.
I definitely think so, too. And it definitely has a lot of trade-offs. It's powerful in close range. It can combat a Nasher if you're skillful enough to use it. And for a core setting, is definitely pretty balanced. Now, in the terms of a hammer burst, I won't deny that the hammer burst is like a sinner's weapon or anything like that. It's definitely really powerful, and it's a really good crossing tool. I guess the only problem I have with it, whenever a whole team spawns with the hammer burst and is able to basically burst people down in like half a millisecond, and hair's torn out, my Astros are probably halfway across the room in pieces. And I guess it's just a problem with basically a bunch of people having it, and where the line gets really blurry is that, in my opinion, I am going to have to contrast with chaps in the essence. Like, I feel like there should be a hammer burst as a pickup weapon on the field instead, due to the sheer power of the hammer burst. Or if it is going to be a startup weapon, maybe tune it down a little bit. Maybe give it a little bit of a boost whenever you have a pre-active with it, or basically anything with that in mind.
Yeah, so Waldo, I know you don't play core very much.
I love the Enforcer, actually. So I will tell you that I think that gun is underused in competitive by a lot, just because I have no window where I can't be shooting that thing. I think it's like less than a half second where you do the reload. You can not even hit the active and still be taking people out. I actually, when the game came out, I was just using the Enforcer all the time, and I was picking up tons of kills with it, and I was really proficient with it. I think that there are certain aspects of the competitive where if we did the right things, you could have competitive loadouts in certain things. I think the Lancer Gnasher makes it a little bit easier, and I understand why it's there. I've always thought about having people that are proficient as secondary weapon players. If you look like Explosives from Optic Gaming, he's the best player with a Retro Lancer that I've ever seen in any Gears title that it's existed. So from Gears 3 on, he is so good with that weapon. And my argument is the gun is broken, but it does so much damage. It has no fall off and no trade-offs to it, but he can down people across the map just playing support fire with it. And I think I saw one game where he had like 18 downs in 5 rounds because the weapon was down. So you're talking about there are players that are going to have a higher skill ceiling than others with it. So I can see that happening. And starting out with a hammer burst, they did that in Gears 2, but the hammer burst was not the same weapon that we're looking at right now. It was like a single fire. And when you can just beam people and it's based on how fast your trigger speed is, and it has no firing cap, it's not okay. It ended up being really bad for the tournament and ended up getting switched back. But at the same time, I understand it. I think that players playing a little bit farther back, having a hammer burst to kind of pepper somebody as they're going in, especially with the damage trade-off, like the closer you get, the less it does. I think it can work. It just depends on how everything in the game types and everything in those dynamics work, because you're playing with the balance. It's like, oh, we all have Lancers. Oh, two people have hammer bursts. What if one guy, like, if they split smokes and stuns, what if the guy in the back has a smoke or has a stun and then he has a hammer burst and you're standing out in the open and you're just, you're dead to rights just because of it. We're talking about different loadouts for the next game. I don't know how you do that. I don't mind it. I like competitive depth. I like having some variety in there so it's not as vanilla, but I don't know how you would effectively balance it to control what players are using. So that's the difficult side of it.
Yeah, because like the core perspective, they're actually talking about removing it and making it a secondary in core even, which I would be against. I'd want them to try to balance it and keep it as a loadout. But even on the competitive side, like you were saying, I'd like to see that depth and add more variety. You have maybe your home hill player on some maps who are going to be sitting back a little further. Maybe they'll want to opt in for a hammer burst. Although if they get rushed, it sort of sucks not having that Lancer there. But
that's all right. Headshots. That's all you got to do.
Yeah,
shoot him in the face.
I feel like Gears 3 put a bad taste in people's mouth with the hammer burst and the loadout options.
I do want to confess that in Gears 3, I knew about the shooting through walls glitch back in the beta, and I never said anything because I was like, no one gets to know about this. This is my trick. And then eventually everybody figured it out. I was like, I think it took 3 patches to patch that out, actually, for the first-person perspective. But it was, when I figured it out in the beta, my friend Andre was like, dude, you're shooting through the wall. I was like, really? I was like, I see him. It's like, yeah, you're shooting through the wall. I was like, don't tell anybody. We kept our mouths shut about it.
Like, yeah, I mean, just having, I don't know, Gears 3 put a bad taste in people's mouth. I think Coalition was way too quick to throw the loadout option out the window for competitive. I think, I don't know how much time they spent trying to balance it in competitive, but I feel like it would have been a nice thing to have.
I don't know. I wasn't at those playtests, so I don't know exactly what the conversation points are. I can speculate what they are, but I have no idea. Really, it's just because it's so much easier. Everyone's just, what you have a Lancer, and if it's tuned properly, and you have a shotgun and it's tuned properly, you don't really need to have too much else. And especially with the game type where you get to put weapons down on the map and it's not like there's stuff to pick up, it works. It just, I don't know. It's weird. It's one of those weird situations where it's a gray area that I don't know how other people would respond to it.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I'm speculating here too, but even with the current Gears 4 competitive system we have, I mean, to me, the Nasher is probably more entertaining to watch than, or Nasher on Nasher versus a Nasher on Enforcer. Just probably more entertaining to watch those shotgun battles. And then maybe starting off with a hammer burst might kind of promote people to stay on a home hill or just kind of ding people from far away. Whereas a Lancer, you can still provide that support, but you kind of have to be a bit closer and it's just more consistent. So I think they're just two weapons that are just, really strong and provide good, entertaining gameplay. So that's why I like it. But I guess I am with Waldo in that it just isn't explored that much. I was also going to say, though, in terms of like how it is just in the regular playlist, I think like different loadouts are really fun and we should encourage them, but I kind of wish the Coalition would address faster if there is discrepancy in weapon values, because yeah, we've talked about the hammer burst and how it's overpowered, but how long has it been allowed to just stay like that? And that kind of hurts the game. It needs to be addressed quickly, weapon imbalances, if you're going to allow for different loadouts.
Yep. Let's see. So there's another topic I wanted to bring up, which, Waldo, I haven't spoken to you about this one in quite a while, but I know last time we spoke you were pretty
I hate it.
pretty
I
strong
know where
feelings.
we're going.